So, Doug, could you just maybe begin by talking about how you personally got involved in the South African anti-apartheid movement?
I was in seminary, I think, when I became most involved. I was certainly aware of the issue, but the seminary I went to, Chicago Theological Seminary, there were several students there from South Africa, black and white, and it was probably the first time that they had interacted on any equal basis. And so the issue was not only very alive as a justice issue, but it was alive personally for us in interacting with them. So we also began doing involvement with getting the seminary to divest.
And then you came to Grand Rapids in the late 70s, and through which organizations or which connections did you continue that work here in Grand Rapids?
It was primarily through the Institute for Global Education and the American Friends Service Committee. They were very much involved one with another at that point, and were quite early on looking at and talking about South Africa injustice issues. And so I went to a meeting at the YWCA, which is where they met in those days, and I believe about South Africa, not divestiture per se, as I recall, but went to a meeting and decided that this was a group that I definitely needed to be involved with, and this was one of many issues I was involved with IGE, but this was one of the early ones, and one that we had an awful lot of activity around.
And one of the main strategies of the local effort was trying to get the City Commission to adopt a resolution and participate in the divestiture as well. Can you talk a little bit about your involvement in that process?
Yeah, it was really a whole strategy. It was to get Grand Rapids itself first to be much more aware of the issues, especially the churches, because there was still a fellowship between the Christian Reformed Church USA and the NG Kerk, the dominant apartheid church in South Africa. So it was an overall awareness campaign, and then, but specifically the specific action then, which that led to, or we wanted it to lead to, was divestiture. The divestiture movement was becoming strong, though states had not gotten on board by that point. Very, very few cities had, but it was beginning. Some of what people might have called the more progressive cities around the nation had been involved, but cities like Grand Rapids, or that people judged like Grand Rapids, were not at all involved. So the involvement of Grand Rapids, both the city commission, going before the county commission, and then the success at the city and at the school board, and then at the state level as well, was something that was pretty important.
What kinds of things were sort of necessary, do you think, to eventually get the support of the city commission to adopt the resolution and then to actually divest themselves? And what kinds of influence did you wield in terms of what you brought to the table when sort of presenting that proposal to them?
Well, first it was a grassroots effort, which I think was important. And we drew the link between injustice and racism locally and in South Africa, and that we couldn't ignore the racism there or here. That there it was state sanctioned, and so we could have an influence on it. And so we needed to, one, draw those connections, two, get people, regular citizens, to be concerned about it, and then to have the Public Relations Commission involved with drawing that link between the local issues and injustice, but this was something that Grand Rapids citizens did and needed to care about, and therefore the city needed to act on it. So it was getting letters, a lot of conversations with, meeting with the Community Relations Commission, who, as I remember, and it's been a number of years ago now, but as I remember, were open to it from the beginning. Just needed to hear that it was a concern for people, how it tied together locally. and that then this was something that really could make a statement and make an impact.
And as you said to me earlier, that when it came before the city commission, it was a 7-0 vote in favor of adopting resolution, which in some ways is pretty astounding.
Yeah, we were. I think by the time the vote happened, the work had been done, and we were pretty clear of what had gone on. But when you think about it, because it was with the close ties that a lot of people had with South Africa, with the dominant group in South Africa, to move past that and to think that our small city, relatively small city, and its relatively small idle funds that were the ones that could be divested could make a difference, said something. But it also meant that it wasn't just symbolic, because there were real funds that were divested. And then, of course, you have to deal with the whole thing of, well, does divestment work? What's the cost going to be to the portfolio and so forth? But any concerns about that notwithstanding, the city commission was clear. This is something that we shall do, and obviously the 7-0 vote meant that everybody was on board.
Well, then, as you mentioned, you eventually went on and got the Grand Rapids Public School Board to do the same kind of thing, which is interesting. Thinking, school board is sort of a different animal, but what was the reception you got when you presented that to them?
Well, we worked first through the finance committee, and got finance committee people involved, understood, and then the board itself. I believe that wasn't a unanimous vote. That was how many people were on the school board at that point? That was probably I think there were 2 nay votes on that one, but it was still more than just a simple majority. So as I recall, the reception from those who were closest to it was quite strong, but there were a few that I don't recall now. I think they just felt like the school board didn't have any business being making that statement. On the other hand, again, we drew the connections. Mm-hmm. There also, by that point, was some push from the state for divestiture, not only on the state level, but as I recall, there had been some kind of action introduced. I don't know if it passed I don't believe it passed at that point on the state level for school boards to divest. So I think they had some sense that entities around them had, and if the city of Grand Rapids could, they could as well.
Obviously, one of the largest elements of resistance to the organizing you were doing would come from the sort of the financial, the business sector at some level, and I'm aware of that there was a push to sort of sell South African Krugerrands locally, and the IG South Africa Working Group sort of responded to that. Can you talk a little bit about what action you took around that?
Yeah, sure. In some ways, the Krugerrand was one of the big issues because people eventually began to get worried about investments in South Africa, and that was one of the things that we could say. If it's such an unstable place, it's not a good place to invest. Of course, corporations usually had smaller holdings in South Africa, so that was a little bit different issue. But the Krugerrand was direct to South Africa, and they began as I recall, the South African government really began pushing Krugerrands. That was direct, money to them. So there were financial entities locally who were pushing the Krugerrand, and there was one gathering that I recall where there was a public invitation by this company for people to come and hear about Krugerrands, about the great stable investment in this gold, and as a hedge against inflation and all kinds of things. It turned out not to be a good investment regardless, but the Krugerrand specifically. So we simply responded to the invitation to come, and we being the South Africa Working Group. So there was a presentation, And we had scattered out and looked very different one from another. There were, students and business types and so forth. So when the Q&A began, we raised our hands and they'd call on us, and we would ask them difficult questions about Krugerrand and the support for the South African government and apartheid, etc. And they would stumble through an answer to one, and then they would call on a safe-looking businessman type on the other side of the room, and that was one of us as well. And so then they would stumble through an answer with that one, and look to a nicely dressed older woman that looked safe on the other side of the room, and she was one of us as well. And so I don't think they got. They ended very quickly, and people were pretty. It was pretty clear that there was some real trouble with the Krugerrand, and I don't think they sold any at that gathering. And I certainly didn't hear of. There were no more public meetings that I heard about from from any of the companies in relation to the Krugerrand.
Okay. Well, I know then, looking at the letters of people who sent letters to the City Commission and Community Relations Commission to get it pass it, the resolution, that you were one of those that did that. So I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what sort of motivated you personally to be involved in that, and then also being a pastor of UCC Church, sort of what was the UCC's sort of position on that at the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, for me personally, it was just an issue of justice. I mean, it looks so simple now. How could anyone have missed that kind of racism and various injustices take so many forms, and sometimes they're very subtle, no less debilitating, but very subtle. This was not at all subtle. I mean, this was state sanctioned. So how could that be missed? And it was being supported all over the world. And so there was just nothing other to do than be actively against it in ways that could make a difference. And so, from my theological perspective, I mean, I see the gospel as one of liberation and of a radical equality, and so to not act would have simply gone against everything that I believed. The church, both the local church and this is the one I pastor, and the denomination, were in the very same place with that. I don't remember when the denomination divested, and it has many entities and many groups with investments, and so they divested at various times. But the denomination came out very early against apartheid, of course, and for divestiture. And it's and we have very close ties. We have missionaries in South Africa. We have a South African working group on the denominational level and so forth. So we were very much in step with the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and in fact had several speakers at our various national meetings from South Africa. The local church as well, though we didn't have any funds to divest from South Africa, was very much for divestiture, and very much in relation to helping people understand the horrible racist injustice that was going on there.
Well, in terms of South African apartheid eventually being dismantled, 10 or so years after the City Commission passed the resolution, but it really was the result of a cumulative effect of all kinds of communities like Grand Rapids taking a public position on this issue. How significant do you think it is in terms of Grand Rapids? Because earlier you mentioned sort of the connection to the CRC and sort of the Dutch heritage. How significant was it for Grand Rapids to be involved in the anti-apartheid movement?
I think it was significant both for Grand Rapids and for the movement. Again, with any movement, who knows where the tipping point is, but so to be involved with something that significant was important for the city. But for the city itself to take a stance against something that was happening on the other side of the world, even though the connections were clear, that was important. But for Grand Rapids itself, South Africans understood that the heritage connection, the strong church bond early on, and they were very aware of Grand Rapids, the educational institutions here, and so forth. And so it really did make a difference when Grand Rapids, again, because of our size of city, but because of the connections that so many people and institutions had to South Africa, they took notice. In fact, and I don't remember the details anymore, but there was a delegate that came from South Africa to the United States specifically trying to deal with anti-apartheid, the movement against, the anti-apartheid movement. And that person came to Washington, D.C. I don't remember where else, very few other places, but they came to Grand Rapids, Michigan. That was an intentional stop because of the kinds of connections and the significance that it had. So it was no small thing to get both the connection that we had, but also a city, especially at that point, that had a reputation as being conservative and very business dominant. For us to do that was no small thing in the whole the whole movement that eventually led to the change in South Africa.
Maybe just by way of wrapping up, could you maybe just speak a bit about why do you think it's important that people know this history, particularly for Grand Rapids, and particularly in relationship to maybe like what's happening, what people are thinking about now, what's going on in the world now?
Well, to know that we have been involved with a significant injustice issue, and did something specific to combat that is important. To see that people have been able, grassroots folks are able to make significant change in the city is important. So to see that with some very significant issues now, that are injustices, huge injustices to categories of people as well, that the city does have a role, the community does have a role, the institutions in the community does have a role to play, and that it's not new ground. There is a path for doing this, and a successful one, and certainly proved to be very much on the right side of history in that regard. And I think any time an entity stands for justice and with folks who are marginalized or treated unjustly, they're going to be on the right side of history eventually.